Hello lovely people! Welcome to another historical profile, this time of American abolitionist, political activist and disabled icon, Harriet Tubman. Today's video is sponsored by my favourite VPN, Suffrage, and I'll be telling you about them a little bit later. As a quick aside before we get into things, I'm going to be taking next week off, because we need to focus on house renovations and the carpenter has become my nemesis and I'm going to be finding new ways to glare at him for getting sticky handprints on things that he is not even working on. Like every single door handle. Why? Now, most people are at least aware of Harriet Tubman, although they might not know the specifics of her story. As an English person, we don't learn about her in school. We remember that she was born into slavery and not only escaped herself, but returned at least a dozen times in order to aid others in their escapes to freedom. She also served as part of the Union Army during the American Civil War and was an activist in the struggle for women's suffrage. Also, unfortunately, Kanye West said some stuff recently, but we're kind of skating over that because she was already on my list to talk about, and there is some icky dialogue relating to his potential mental illnesses, so yeah. What you may not be aware of is that, like many stories of important figures, Harriet's description is missing one key thing, that she was also disabled. In many portrayals of famous people with disabilities, it's either swept under the rug, or if it's mentioned, it's as a side note, and not treated as an integral part of their person. This is problematic for a number of reasons, and do we just not think that disability is important? Are we saying that ignoring someone's disability is a kindness? It's disrespectful to the person themselves and to others who might see themselves reflected. Harriet's disability is just as important to her life story as the abolitionist work that she did, particularly considering that she may have been injured in the line of protecting another slave. The identity disabled is as equal as any other, and it's not one that we should be ashamed of. And we shouldn't be teaching others to feel that way either. The disabled community needs role models and historical figures of inspiring character. It's important for non-disabled people as well, so that they can see disabled people are more than just one thing, and that we can also be wonderful. We are wonderful. Representation helps not only the people being represented, but also the wider community to adjust their thinking. And that's why I created this historical profile series, in order to learn more about great people from our history. So please, share this video and help educate others. Harriet Tubman was born as Araminta Ross in around 1822 to enslaved parents Harriet Ritt Green, who was owned by Mary Patterson Brodress and worked as a cook, and Ben Ross, who was owned by Anthony Thompson, the owner of a large plantation on which Ben worked as a skilled woodsman. Mary Patterson Brodress then took Anthony Thompson as her second husband. The exact date of Harriet's birth is actually unknown, as with many slaves in the United States, her birth was not officially recorded, and thus different dates are given on different documents. Harriet reported her birth year as 1825, but her death certificate actually lists her birth as 1815, and her gravestone says 1820. We only have information about one of her grandparents, her maternal grandmother Modesty, who arrived in the United States on a slave ship from Africa, although which part is also unknown. Her parents, Ritt and Ben, had married in 1808 and had 9 children together, 4 boys and 5 girls, of which Harriet was the 4th. Like all slaves, they did not own even their own children, and the 3 oldest daughters were sold out of state, separating them from the family forever. When a trader from Georgia approached their owner in regards to buying the youngest son, Moses, Ritt hid him for a month, aided by other slaves and the free black people who lived in the community. Finally, when they came close to seizing the little boy, Ritt threatened, "You are after my son, but the first man that comes into my house, I will split his head open." The sale was abandoned, and this courageous moment is what many biographers point to as the moment Harriet realised the possibilities of resistance. Harriet, Araminta as she was known at the time, was first hired out at the age of 5 or 6 to work as a nursemaid for a local woman. She was ordered to care for the baby and rock its cradle as it slept. Every time it woke up and cried, she was whipped. Although she found her own ways to resist, such as wearing layers of clothes for protection and running away, she carried the scars from that time for the rest of her life. She then moved to working checking animal traps and was forced to do so even after contracting measles. Eventually she became so ill that she was sent back to her mother to be nursed back to health. As she grew older and stronger, she was assigned to field and forest work, driving oxen, ploughing and hauling logs, where a terrible accident happened. I say accident, but someone was definitely at fault. They just had terrible aim. Whilst attempting to stop a slave from escaping, an overseer picked up a 2-pound metal weight and threw it, striking the teenage Harriet in the head instead. Although the history is a little shaky, as some report that she deliberately stepped in the path of the weight to protect the other slave. The head injury was severe, but bleeding and unconscious, Harriet was merely dumped back at her owner's house, where she was laid out without medical care for 2 days as her broken skull bled. With time and her mother's attention, Harriet was able to recover to a degree, although she had seizures and would frequently lapse into unconsciousness, along with having painful headaches. This was likely, we now know, from a temporal lobe epilepsy as a result of the injury. She described being aware during her seizures, which means she probably had the focal aware type of seizure, which can come on with hallucinations and visual distortions. To Harriet, however, these were revelations from God. And they might well have been, no one can 100% disprove that. These spiritual experiences had a profound effect on her, and she became devoutly religious. However, she rejected the teachings of the New Testament that urged slaves to be obedient and found guidance in the Old Testament's tales of deliverance. In 1840, at the age of 45, Harriet's father Ben was manumitted, meaning that he was released from slavery. Ben continued to work as a timber estimator and foreman for the Thompson family, but now with pay, because you should pay people for their work. Harriet's mother, Rit, should also have been manumitted at the age of 45, according to legal documents, and similar provision therefore should have been given to her children, along with any children she had after the age of 45 being born legally free. But her owners at the time had just ignored this stipulation when they inherited her, and it was impossible for her to challenge it legally, because she didn't have the money and she was black, and the system is racist. Shocker. In around 1844, Harriet married a free black man named John Tubman and changed her name from Araminta Ross to Harriet Tubman. Such unions between free black people and slaves were not uncommon on the eastern shore of Maryland, as by this time half of the black population was free. It was greatly complicated, however, by the legal requisite that the mother's status dictated that of any children. Thus, any children that Harriet and John had would be born slaves, even though their father was free. Still dealing with seizures and narcolepsy, around 4 years later, in 1849, Harriet became deathly ill again, which diminished her value as a slave. Her owner tried to sell her, but could not find a buyer. She prayed fervently for him to leave her alone, but he did not. So instead, she prayed for his death, and 1 week later, he died. Harriet was regretful but moved by the power of her prayers. Whilst the estate, slaves included, was put up for sale, she made her escape along with 2 of her brothers, Ben and Henry. Her husband tried to dissuade her, but as she later repeated, she replied, "There was one of 2 things I had the right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other." 2 weeks later, a notice was put up for their return, and her brothers convinced her to return with them, likely because one of them had just become a father and didn't want to leave his young family. Soon afterwards, Harriet escaped again, but this time without her brothers. She made use of the Underground Railroad, an informal but very well-organized system that was made up of free and enslaved black people working with white abolitionists and other activists, if you've ever seen The Handmaid's Tale. Prominent at that time were members of the Religious Society of Friends, otherwise known as Quakers. Yes, that's my religion. We're cool. Known as conductors, the people who helped move others along the Underground Railroad had to use a series of deception. At one stop, Harriet was asked to sweep the front yard in order to give the neighbours a reason for her presence. Please ignore any noise in this video, it's my nemesis, the carpenter. She took a route northeast along the Choptank River, through Delaware, and then north into Pennsylvania, the state founded by the Quaker William Penn, just saying. A journey of nearly 90 miles that would have taken up to 3 weeks as she travelled by night, guided by the North Star. Particulars of that first journey remained secret for many years, however. Since other fugitive slaves used the routes, Harriet did not discuss them until later in life. Crossing over into Pennsylvania, she recalled a feeling of relief and awe. When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. She immediately thought of her family and how she could return to free them too. However, US Congress then passed the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which heavily punished abetting escape and forced law enforcement officials to assist in their capture, even in states that had outlawed slavery. But one small group at a time, Harriet went back to guide other slaves to freedom in British North America. Canada, which as part of the British Empire had abolished slavery in 1833. In the autumn of 1851, Harriet returned to Dorchester County for the first time since her escape, hoping to find her husband John and take him with her to Philadelphia. Prior to travelling, she took various jobs in order to save enough money to buy him a suit. But when she made her way south, she found that he'd married another woman. Oh, John. Harriet considered storming their house and making a scene, but decided that John was not worth the trouble. Ugh, John. Whatever though. Instead, she found some slaves who wanted to escape and led them to freedom in Philadelphia. Like a boss. Over 11 years, Harriet repeatedly returned to the eastern shore of Maryland, rescuing at least 70 slaves in around 13 expeditions, including her brothers, their wives, and their children. She also provided instructions to 60 other fugitives who were then able to escape to the north, although many historians say that she actually aided hundreds of people in their escape. It's difficult to know. For her efforts, she was nicknamed Moses, alluding to the prophet who led the Hebrews to freedom from Egypt. This was all, by the way, done while she was still suffering from brain damage and seizures. Her work ferrying people to freedom was incredibly dangerous and required astounding ingenuity. She mainly worked during the winter months to minimise the chances of being seen by passers-by, and she always left town on Saturday evenings as runaway adverts couldn't be printed until Monday morning. Harriet also carried a newspaper as subterfuge, since she was publicly known to be illiterate, and apparently that's all the disguise you need when you're black and surrounded by white people who view you as chattel and can't tell black people apart. I don't really need to add anything to that, do I? Let's go to an advert break instead.
Oh no!
Scared of surfing the web?
Uh-huh.
You need Surfshark, the virtual private network that lets you learn new things and stay safe while browsing the internet.
Wow!
With this VPN app and browser extension, you'll be able to access the internet safely and without barriers. Surfshark encrypts your data when you log on to public Wi-Fi, meaning that hackers can't gain access, and you're safe even when logging into your bank account whilst outside.
What is public Wi-Fi? What is outdoors?
Fair enough. All you need to know is that Surfshark keeps all of your passwords, photos and videos safe, but doesn't store any of your passwords itself. And it's not just malicious data stealing that you'll be protected from. Oh no! Surfshark will also defend you from tracking, surveillance and commercial targeting.
No malware? No phishing?
No, you'll be safe on the web. And not only that, because Surfshark hides your IP address, you'll be able to set your location to anywhere in the world and thus watch videos and amazing documentaries that aren't available in your country, including videos right here on YouTube.
Wow!
All you have to do is click the link in the description of this video and use the code Jessica for 85% off and 3 months extra for free.
Oh golly, free?
Yes, I said free. Surfshark is the only VPN that lets you use one account across unlimited devices, meaning you can watch documentaries on your phone, your iPod, your laptop, your iPad and your desktop.
Gee whiz.
We now resume normal programming. It would be remiss if I didn't tell you that Harriet was also a great fan of the revolver and wasn't afraid to use it. Whilst having a gun obviously gave some protection against the ever-present slave catchers and their dogs, it was also a great enticement to escaped slaves with low morale who wanted to turn back and thus would be endangering the rest of the group. Famous social reformer and abolitionist Frederick Douglass was known to Harriet and they admired each other greatly. It is thought that they crossed paths many times as Harriet brought escapees through the Underground Railroad. They were also both members of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, an independent black denomination first established in New York City, which also counted Sojourner Truth amongst its members. One of her last missions into Maryland was to retrieve her aging parents. Her father Ben had purchased her mother Rit in 1855. Even when they were both free, the area was hostile to their presence as they were suspected of helping slaves along with their daughter. Harriet led them north to St. Catharines, Ontario, where a community of former slaves, including Tubman's brothers, relatives and many friends, had gathered. Slaveholders in the region never knew who was behind the disappearances of their slaves, and never would have guessed that Minty, the petite, disabled slave who had run away years earlier, was the reason. Instead, they suspected that a white northern abolitionist was the one enticing slaves away, and it wasn't until years later that Harriet shared her story publicly. She was never captured, and neither were the fugitives she guided. Years later, she told an audience, "I was conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." When the Civil War began, Harriet worked for the Union Army. At first, she was a cook and nurse. In fact, when she tended to men with smallpox and didn't catch the disease, many saw it as a sign that she was truly blessed by God. Her other skills, however, were soon recognized, and she began to work as an armed scout and spy. Because she was just that cool. She was the first woman to lead an armed expedition in the war, guiding the raid at Combahee Ferry, and she was able to liberate more than 700 slaves. For all 4 years of the Civil War, she worked hard for the government and even donated several more months of service once the war had ended. Despite this, she was never given a regular salary, and when being given extra rations caused tensions with other free black people in the army, she gave those up too. Her unofficial status and the unequal payments offered to black soldiers caused great difficulty in documenting her service, and the US government was slow in recognizing its debt to her. As she dedicated her life to caring for others, she lived in a state of constant poverty. Her friends and supporters from her days of abolition, meanwhile, raised funds to help her. One, Sarah Hopkins Bradford, wrote an authorized biography entitled Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman, which was published in 1869 and brought Harriet a good income as well as a little fame. It isn't necessarily the best written book in the world, but it is a good source of information on Harriet's life. She also took in boarders to help pay the bills, and one was a farmer named Nelson Charles Davis, who, despite being 22 years younger and a hell of a lot taller than she was, she fell deeply in love with. They were married in 1869 and adopted a baby girl named Gertie a few years later. The same year she was married, she was attacked by a conductor on a train ride to New York. He asked her to move from the half-price section to the baggage car where black people were supposed to ride, according to him. She refused and showed him the government-issued papers that entitled her to ride there. He grabbed her and summoned other passengers for help. She clutched the railing, but they broke her arm and pulled her away, throwing her into the baggage car and causing more injuries. She was attacked again a few years later and had all of her money stolen. This caused a public outrage and refreshed the public's memory of her past service. 2 representatives introduced a bill to the Senate that Harriet be paid the sum of $2,000 for services rendered by her to the Union Army as scout, nurse, and spy. But it was defeated. Fortunately, the Dependent and Disability Pension Act of 1890 made Tubman eligible for a pension as the widow of Nelson Davies. After she documented her marriage and her husband's service record to the satisfaction of the Bureau of Pensions, probably a 100-page form if we know anything about government benefits. In 1895, she was finally granted a widow's pension of $8 a month, equivalent to around $250 today, plus a lump sum of $500, around $15,400 today. I mean, still not enough. That was meant to cover the 5-year delay in approval. Again, it took a few more years of arguing in Congress until finally, in February of 1899, President William McKinley approved a compromise amount of an extra $12 per month for her service as a nurse, but did not acknowledge her as a scout and spy. Thanks. You can blame that on sexism, racism, or ableism. What a fun trifecta. Harriet was also active in the women's suffrage movement until illness overtook her and she had to be admitted to a home for elderly African Americans that she had helped to establish years earlier. She was once asked whether she truly believed that women deserved to have the vote, and she replied, "I suffered enough to believe it." She spoke publicly and described her actions during and after the Civil War, along with the sacrifices of countless women throughout modern history, as evidence of women's equality to men. Her feminist activism kindled a new wave of support and admiration for Harriet amongst the press in the United States. After her death in 1913, she became an icon of courage and freedom. In April 2016, Obama-era US Treasury Secretary Jack Lew announced plans to add a portrait of Tubman to the front of the $20 bill, moving the portrait of slave-owning President Andrew Jackson to the rear of the bill. It was slated to enter circulation sometime after 2020. However, in 2017, US Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said that he would not commit to putting Tubman on the $20 bill, saying, "People have been on the bills for a long period of time and something we'll consider. Right now we have more important issues to focus on." Because of course he did. I mean, it's not like it's the worst thing that the Trump administration's ever done, but you know. So, with all of her great achievements, why is it important that we remember Harriet Tubman as not only an abolitionist icon and a feminist icon, but a disabled icon as well? Firstly, it's important to note that she became disabled because of slavery, and that those two things are intertwined. Not only that, but her enslaved body was deemed a financial liability because it was disabled. So we do her no service by ignoring the very real additional hardships she must have struggled with. Making that journey to freedom time and time again is hard enough, but to add on top of that seizures and temporal lobe problems, it's extraordinary. Being disabled is a part of her identity, and it affected how she was treated by society. If we ignore it, we cannot tell her story with honesty and respect. There were a lot of discussions around who should play Harriet in the eponymous film of her life, which was released in 2019, but I didn't see a lot of talk about whether or not she should be played by a disabled actress, or whether that would even be taken into consideration in the plot. It feels like most people are even unaware that Harriet was disabled, and that it's just sort of largely missed from history classes about her. But what does it say about the very identity of disability itself that it's something that we're considering so unimportant it doesn't need to be included? Representation involves honesty, and one identity feeds into another. We must include disability within our discussions of historical icons, which is why I hope you'll subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and check out my playlist on wonderful disabled or queer icons, sometimes both. You can find that link in the description or by clicking the card in the top left corner. Let me know your suggestions on who I should profile next in the comments below. And remember, I will be off next week, but I will be back after that, and I'll see you then.